nonetheless.
Fantastic. That was very fast. All right. So, Renee, would you like to kick us off and kind of start?
Sure.
Things. I don't know. I know with this being kind of most of the planning board, if there's anything formally or officially you need to do or get out of the way at the start.
We didn't do anything. We don't have any business, so we're just going to get right into the zoning update. I will say this is the planning board and the zoning update committee meeting May 20th, 7:00. We're going to be reviewing the documents that Molly and John have sent over to us. I think our last personal meeting was in November, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think, have we seen each other in person since then?
I do believe that we had that workshop in January.
Yes.
Oh, the January workshop.
Yep.
Yep, that's right. We did the mapping, so.
We did meet again in February.
Without Molly and John.
Yeah.
Right. So, so Molly, why don't you just kick off? I did in advance send all the documents over to the committee members, so hopefully everybody's had a chance to look it over. I have a few notes, but why don't you give us a little overview of the documents and the things that went into what you sent? I thought they looked fantastic.
Great. Yeah. So I have a bit of a presentation, just kind of help us kind of guide the conversation for the meeting tonight. Oh, this always happens. 1 second. All right. So for, kind of our agenda, we always like to start with some sort of update on where we are in the process. And then I'd like to do just a quick review of sort of the code outline as we see it. So what's drafted, what we're going to kind of be looking at next, and all the different components. And then we'll have our discussion on the draft districts and maps, depending on how many comments or questions you have. It could be a long conversation. It could be a short one. And then I also just want to take a chance to introduce to you the concept of the additional use regulation section, because that is essentially one will be the next item that's going to come to you before we wrap up what we consider the district and use framework.
Great.
Next steps. So in terms of the project timeline, we're right on schedule. We're going into spring. We'll be having looked at the draft districts and maps. So at this time, maybe I would say we're a meeting behind in that we're not quite looking at the design standards yet. But that's okay. We'll make up ground because the next piece is pretty quick. So we'll do the additional use and the off-street parking regulations, things like that. And then moving into summer, we'll start to get into more of the administrative sections, and then wrap up and have a draft by fall and be able to go through the formal adoption process at that time. Are there any questions on the process or anything now? Okay, cool. So in terms of the outline, just wanted to give everybody an opportunity to kind of see cumulatively how this all fits together. So in the draft that was sent out, you'll notice there's kind of a quasi table of contents on the front there. And that's, as it stands, kind of the outline of the articles as we anticipate them to come together. That doesn't mean that's the final answer. Some things might be broken out. We might have to add a couple or combine a couple. But essentially, we're looking at it in the context of 4 general sections. So one being the enactment and the legal section. That's your introductory provisions. And that, is essentially the part of the code that you're probably never going to look at again. It's the part you need, but, it kind of just sticks in there. Then a bulk of what we're talking about today and we'll be doing with the additional district and use regulations is what we call the district and use framework. So that is included obviously in the draft that we have put together. So those 3 articles, 2, 3, and 4, are what we drafted to date, along with the revised zoning map. The third section that of regulations we'll look at are the development standards. So that's the off-street parking requirements, landscaping, and design standards, and that could include any wherever our discussion lands on historic design standards or anything like that. That would be where that could be included as well. And then the final piece is the administration and review sections. So that's your applications, procedures, enforcement, and definitions. This, I think, a lot of people find really helpful if we can kind of show you a comparison of what these sort of new proposed articles include in terms of what you already have. So Article 1 is actually pretty much a 1-for-1. Aside from the fact that the definitions in your current code are in Article 1, all of that is pretty much going to be updated and carried over into the revised version. Your existing Article 3 that outlines the zoning district regulations in there, we've broken up, obviously, into Articles 2, 3, and 4. And then you also have in the code's Article 4 section some supplementary regulations, and that includes things like your regulations for fences, for encroachments in yards, sections 405, 406, all of those are additional use regulations. So the things that you're expecting from adult uses or gas stations, or, the things that there's an extra set of standards that apply. So all of that will be packaged into one section in Article 5. And then Article 6, the planned unit development, is going to be consistent. We'll make the necessary amendments, but to what's in your Article 3. In terms of the off-street parking, loading, and access management, all the development standards actually are probably going to be pretty new compared to what you have now. I know there is some language talking about screening, and there is some language talking about some element of design, but those largely don't exist as their own sections with any real level of guidance now. So we'll be establishing that and putting those in as new sections. And then we'll build off of the sections 401, 402, and 403 that have parking, but that's also probably going to get beefed up and changed quite a bit so that the regulations themselves suit best practices and are a little bit easier to navigate. And finally, the last section, the application procedures, will establish those very much consistent with the administration section that you have, which is actually Article 2. That's a typo. My apologies. Not Article 4. So that the administration section, all those things that have to deal with applications will be Article 10, and all those things that have to do with the various administrative and enforcement bodies will be in Article 11. And then definitions stays as definitions. Definitions will likely be the very last section that we touch, just because it's a lot easier as we go through and we're changing, maybe uses, adding uses, changing terms or things like that. At the end, we can kind of do a catch-all of that. So I like to keep kind of a running list and tally of uses that maybe we've talked about that need to be better defined or that have been added. So we'll take care of that in the last chunk. Are there any questions on that, on sort of the outline as it is, or kind of where things are coming from?
No.
So with that, we'll jump right into the draft districts and map. We talked about this last time, but for these revisions, we are looking at the input from the comprehensive plan to make some of these amendments, and then we're also looking at some of the any public input we've gotten and kind of the tools and the resources that John and I know that can be brought in to help kind of establish a better code for Bergen. So with a lot of what we talked through last time was through the 3 classifications of districts. Mm-hmm. Essentially, what is your current R1 district, we've modified and sort of rebranded as a low-density residential district. And that, as we have it written, includes single-family and 2-family dwellings. And we dropped down the minimum square footage and the minimum lot width because when we went through and did sort of the parcel analysis, there were a lot of single family lots that were non-conforming with the standards as they are. So we wanted to make sure that we adjusted that and made sure that we could accommodate more of what the actual existing development pattern is. And then your existing R2 and R3 is what we established as the traditional village residential. And this is more reflective, if you read the purpose statement in there, of the sort of organic, mixed density feel. It also includes, obviously, the older neighborhoods within the village they might be single family, 2-family homes, might be 3 or 4 family mixed in there, but they're on much smaller lots. It's a little bit of a denser neighborhood environment. So that's what the traditional village residential is. For the commercial districts, we again rebranded. We talked before about how there was the opportunity for, we think, a third commercial district. Currently, the way the village code reads with neighborhood commercial, that to us, it sounds actually a lot more like as it's applied, a lot more like a general commercial district. It permits a really wide variety of commercial uses, at a very large scale, 100-foot lot width and things like that, 80-foot front setback. A lot of that in a neighborhood context could be pretty disruptive. So that we kind of transferred over into what we consider to be the general commercial part of the code and the districts. And that would be one of the newer parts of that, is that we instituted a minimum and a maximum front setback. And that gets to starting to try to reduce the ease with which people come in, and instead of having any buildings or screening or other things at the front of the property, it's parking instead, which doesn't help to sort of create this sense of place or frame the street. So instituting that max setback that hopefully helps do that over time. And then the central commercial district, really, aside from, some tweaks and things, worked really well. Same thing, we rebranded that Village Center Commercial, added a max setback again, just, in case if there was ever infill development or, there was an unfortunate enough situation where something were to burn down, you wouldn't want that to be out of character with the existing development pattern. And the third, and this is, even though it has the same name as one of your existing districts, it's entirely new. The neighborhood commercial district is intended to allow for more flexibility in having either businesses or service type use, retail or service type uses that are small in scale and have a limited impact or intensity on adjacent uses. Typically, if it's a single family home or something next door. And the way the draft district as it stands helps to do that is it restricts the use by scale. So you wouldn't be, have a 5,000 square foot convenience store that's going to have probably a lot more traffic than the neighbors would appreciate. And then something we added for your consideration to all of the commercial districts were max building footprints. And that is, again, a way to kind of help reduce the scale and the impact of those, but also get a little bit more character out of the buildings themselves, instead of just one giant 30,000, 40,000 square foot building. Even if it's all one use, it could be visually broken up into some smaller sections. So just some of the examples that we talked about before, the general commercial being more of the regional, potentially more auto-oriented type uses, but we're trying to get and push things towards the 3 images, the 2 images on the bottom and the image on the right there. Use more screening, get buildings closer to the street, or use landscaping to kind of soften the street edge. The Village Center Commercial District, same thing. We're taking a look at, we took a lot of guidance from the comp plan on that and maintaining sort of the traditional walkable village character. In the neighborhood commercial, like I talked about before, the idea is that you want, even if you are allowing a new commercial use or conversion of a house to a commercial use, it at least fits in with the character of the residential area. The Dunkin' Donuts there is an example. John, where is that?
That is Penfield, actually, the 5 Mile Line road area, 4 corners of Penfield.
Yep.
Right. So being right on the corner of a neighborhood, and kind of within context of more residentially designed properties, it does a good job, I think, of blending in. And it's also definitely a smaller scale than you might see of a larger Dunkin' with a drive-through or something that could potentially be a nuisance.
Well, the nice thing about that area too, Molly, that beyond the Dunkin' is Starbucks, and beyond that, I know the bank's on the corner. I can't remember if there's something between the Starbucks and the bank, but 2 or 3 of those uses all have drive-throughs. All the parking's been in back. I think it's one of the better examples I've seen of modern auto-oriented uses done in a way that balances the car and the pedestrian.
Yeah.
So really nothing's suffering because the pedestrian realm is intact and the cars still get to do their thing with the drive-through. So it's kind of a win-win.
Yeah. And so, with that in mind, obviously in this draft, it was our first stab, our first guess. So, maybe the numbers on some of these things aren't right. We can have the conversation about that. And again, the mix of uses and things, maybe what's permitted, especially permitted or prohibited. John makes a really good point. When we talk about these and look at the districts, particularly when we talk about the commercial districts, it's helpful. It doesn't always have to just be an answer of the use, yes or no. It could be yes if these things or conditions were met and things like that. So, we can have the conversation, and I know that a lot of communities don't want their zoning codes to be overly restrictive on investment. So there's no reason why, we can't have a conversation on how the districts themselves and these regulations allow for that opportunity, development opportunity or investment opportunity, but make sure that it's doing it in a way that's consistent with what the community values and vision are. So with that, I'm going to stop before we jump into the other stuff, because it sounds like there might be some questions and comments and things on what we've put together.
So I have a question for you, Molly.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually in the residential district.
Okay.
So I don't know if we're getting into the meat of these things, but one of the things that we discussed both at our planning board meeting and also at originally when we were talking about this is how do we address the residential district, the downtown residential district, the TVR. If people want to use that for offices or a small business, would that be in the uses, permitted, special use permit type of thing? So, for example, currently the funeral home is in a residential district. But if, say, I live in the village, I have a giant house, I want to use half of it to run a flower shop so that I can try to keep this house up and running versus having to split it up into apartments.
Sure. Yeah. So that's a good question. That's something that we can definitely deal with a couple different ways. Something like in these examples, the home occupations, that's something that we could get at with the additional regulations. So there's no reason why, if I have a larger home and I want to, carve out some space in it for a salon or the, sales flower sales, things like that you're talking about, we can allow for that in the code. And then the additional use regulations that we'll talk about in a little bit can get to the fact of, making sure that it's not turning into a full-blown retail operation out of your house, that now it's requiring you to have a parking lot and there's cars parking all over the street and stuff like that. So yeah, that's, in terms of people doing some form of business out of their home, we can certainly allow that. If you're talking about homes being fully converted, no one's going to live there anymore, then that is different, that we'd have to talk about.
Okay.
And we can accommodate that too through like an overlay boutique district or something where you can do a hair salon, but it needs to be in a residential structure. so it'll still look residential in character. So it's a good question, Renee, because it's kind of it's a fine line between a beefed up home occupation versus like an overlay district. They both work. There's pros and cons to both. So we got to think about, and we might pick your brain a little bit more as we think about that to find out how far do you want to go with it.
Right. And I mean, we can also talk too about, maybe not even the boutique overlay, but even the neighborhood commercial district. You could talk about allowing conversions, single family homes being converted to that salon like John's talking about, or being converted to a dentist office, something like that.
Right.
So there are definitely ways to do that. We would just need to talk about, what it is we think it looks like and where it might make sense.
Okay. One other question that we had thrown around, and we wanted to get your opinion on this. There are several parcels that are currently in the town. We're just curious. They really run along the village line. Mm-hmm. Is that something at this point in time, as we're redoing this zoning map, that should or could be addressed?
So give me an example.
Okay, so there's a triangle parcel on Buffalo.
Up here?
Down, it's white, it's a triangle. It's on
here.
Right there.
Mm-hmm.
Like that parcel really probably should be in the village. It's odd that it's on the other side of the street and everything else is village.
Mm-hmm.
There's also connected to up at the top in the commercial district in the pink.
Mm-hmm.
The same people who own the pink parcels up here own the parcels in the back that are in the town.
These here.
The other pink ones. All the way up on Buffalo.
Oh, this. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Nope, over on the other side.
Oh, I'm sorry. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So those two parcels that are behind, that are in the town, are owned by the same people who own the 3 parcels in the front.
Mm-hmm.
So is that something that could be addressed, or what happens if they sell the property and they want to do something different on the back part?
So to change, essentially, we're talking about changing the village boundary, right, to follow these other parcels, which would have to be done. It couldn't be done through zoning. That would be through an actual official map amendment or a boundary adjustment, and you'd have to be working with the town to do that.
Right.
So, that's something that you could definitely work through alongside, us doing this process. And then we could easily just make the changes on this map if there was a boundary change. But unfortunately, to kind of answer your question about the other piece, if these backlots here were sold off, and frankly, even now that under the same ownership, these parcels are subject to whatever the town zoning says. So there's no actual impact or accountability relationship between what the village code says versus what the town's code says.
Right.
Any other questions? Or
I've got a question.
Sure.
You mentioned that in the residential districts, you change lot sizes to accommodate non-conforming lots.
Mm-hmm.
What can you give me an idea of how many or what kind of percentage would now be conforming? How big of a difference did you make?
Sure. So that off the top of my head, I can't tell you. I know that where we like to get the analysis is bring it down to, you don't necessarily want to be writing the code off of this little guy right there. Yeah. That's an oddity. It happens. Codes are imperfect. They can't fix everything. So we try to get it around no more than 10 or 15%. That would be non-conforming if we looked at it. That's one thing I can do for you and kind of follow up and send out is I can get into the GIS data and I can actually just have the parcels highlighted that are currently non-conforming and then show the map with the parcels highlighted that would still be considered non-conforming moving forward. So I know we reduced the percentage of lots that are non-conforming, but I don't know by how much.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Hey, Renee, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
As you guys were talking about these other things, I was just kind of poking around the map, and I wanted to, Molly and I always laugh when we say phrases in the meetings. I wanted to circle back, like these business phrases. So I wanted to circle back for a second on that.
We're going to talk about that offline later.
Yes. When you talk about these larger homes that might be suitable for some kind of commercial enterprise, are they strewn throughout in this case, the village residential district, or are they more like I'm looking at Richmond Avenue? Are they kind of these bigger homes everywhere, or are they clustered in along a certain road or two? Does that make sense, that question?
Yes, I would say that they are clustered along 2 or 3 of the main roads here.
Okay.
Obviously, Route 19 has a lot of them. They're very large homes, hard to take care of. There's some on the side streets, like down Mackenzie and Clinton. There's larger homes, but I would say mostly, I would think in the downtown area versus out in Richmond and that way where it's more of the low density. It would definitely be in this area. I was just thinking like Batavia, where they have, an attorney's office, or they use it as offices, but they still keep the character of the home. It still looks like a home.
Yeah. No, that'll thank you, because if they were scattered everywhere, then a neighborhood commercial might not make sense. If it's clustered, then maybe we can bring a couple different tools to bear. So thank you. Let us think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking, with that, John, there's potentially, I don't know about, some of those clusters, we could take a look at it and we could look about applying neighborhood commercial, because neighborhood commercial does talk about wanting to maintain this residential character. And we could specifically speak to the conversion of residences to a commercial use, requiring that there be maintained, the residential character of the structure is maintained. The other option is we could do a similar thing by allowing that conversion of homes in TVR by special permit. The only issue with that is, and the chances of you getting 5, 6, 7 requests on the same street or something like that is probably low. But by doing that, you are opening it up to the whole of the TVR area that would potentially have the opportunity to do that.
And Molly, maybe we ended up, one scenario could be that the second one you just described, but then we put a minimum size or something on it. So these really small lots and smaller homes aren't really candidates for it.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
They're not candidate for a full conversion, but they're a candidate for a home occupation. So that would help us get that level of intensity. That would be interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys, for letting us geek out. Thank you for letting us geek out on zoning for a second.
No problem.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I have this down. All right. Anything else?
I have something else, Molly, but it might be in a different section. So I don't know about accessory buildings.
No, that's fine. I mean,
it's the same issue with and I don't know, we haven't really discussed it, but there are a lot of accessory buildings in that particular residential, barns and things like that currently you can't do anything with. you can't, according to our code, you can't have an accessory apartment, you can't have a business, you can't have anything in these very large structures. And I don't know if that's something, how you address that, or if we want to address it, or if it's something, just something to think about. There's a lot of them around.
Yeah. So we can, so a lot of that will get into the additional use regulations, the accessory structures piece. And to that point, we do have, if you'll notice, we put in there the accessory dwelling unit, which is essentially the accessory apartment provisions. We can talk about, where that makes sense and what it looks like. The additional use regulations would outline that. And what we could do as part of the additional use regulations is specifically stipulate that, if you have these larger structures, they could be converted into accessory apartments or, additional units. We could also include the opportunity for some of those accessory structures. I think we need to be cognizant of where they are, but we could also start to develop sort of these different classifications of home occupations. There's a difference between someone who they're an accountant and they work out of their spare bedroom, like I happen to be doing at this moment in time, versus, although I'm not an accountant, I would be a terrible accountant. Aside from that, then there's the other piece that you're talking about is maybe it's, I have this barn and I grow flowers and make some small crafts and gifts, and I want to have a little boutique or whatever in the larger accessory structure I'm not using. That obviously would be a little bit more of an intense kind of use, because now you have people coming to the space as a retail, business. There's potentially more, demand or traffic associated with that. But we can certainly break down the home occupations into different classifications and then have specific regulations that apply to those. So that would at least allow the opportunity for that in some cases where it makes sense. We did a similar thing. I think the extent to which these types of uses would be permitted, we just talked with the town of Manchester about in their agricultural zoning district to allow farmers the opportunity to use their accessory structures and things for, tractor repair, or people who are paying them to store their RVs or boats or things in their barns. I think that's probably at a scale of use that's more than what the village would want to be looking at, but we could definitely, some small services, nail salons, barbers, people make crafts or grow vegetables and want to have, some place to sell that. Certainly we can take a look at that.
Okay. I just think it's something to think about, and it's some things that we had talked about. I don't know how anybody have any opinion on that.
I think with all of this COVID going on and everything that has been changed or accommodating for that process, we might find that that's going to be something people are going to move towards.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than going into big office buildings and things like that, they may be looking for places to not necessarily work from home, but to develop areas where they could have office space or, places of employment where they didn't necessarily need to do that in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I agree.
Definitely. Okay. So that's good. Anything else from anybody? All right. So that's your question, Renee, then is actually a really good sort of segue into I'm sorry. Before we leave that, I do want to have a conversation about a couple different things. One's kind of a clarification question on our end. The zoning code does mention a floodplain overlay district, and it does say that that's info only. I'm pretty sure that ties to a flood damage prevention law or development permit, something like that. Is that currently used? I mean, is that still something that's being enforced? Because if so, I want to make sure that we are keeping that in the code, and that's, you know, that trigger or that connection stays.
Hannah? Does that have anything to do with our, did we have some kind of like flood insurance or something? Some insurance thing.
I know that the state was working on, we went to a workshop not too long ago, and it was dealing with floodplains and whatnot, and they were drawing out those areas to map them. And I'm not sure where that went. We haven't gotten any updated information on that as yet.
Okay.
We do have the local law from 1989 amending the flood damage prevention provisions. I think that was what you were discussing at our last meeting. So we do have that. That is still on the books.
Okay. So I'll make sure we just connect that to that. I wasn't sure if there was anything that has been either developed or, you know, added to with respect to the floodplain overlay district. Because it's, you know, with the flood damage prevention law, that does obviously require a development permit for some conditions in the floodplain areas. So by keeping that on the zoning map, it at least helps trigger the fact that, oh, all right, this is in a floodplain. We've got to take a look at that chapter. So I'll make sure that that's a reference in there.
Okay. Did I send that to you? I can't remember. I will send it to you if I didn't.
You may have. I just have to take a search in my my email. And the other question, this is kind of a there's no wrong answer, and there's really a ton of different ways that we can approach this. I know there's a lot of talk and support behind establishing, we're not talking historic preservation law level standards, but just some better considerations for traditional character of historic structures along, in the Lake Street Historic District, as well as, potentially the impacts that could happen to other parcels. So we can establish those standards without any kind of overlay district or designated historic zoning district. We can just include those as part of the design standards. But I guess my question is there an interest to take the step to delineate a specific area and start to identify that formally in the zoning code as a historic area? I guess, and this might be an easier question to answer, a little later on when we get into the design standards, but, more or less, when we talk about the traditional Main Street, turn of the century, multi-story mixed use, walkable environment, that's a lot of the design language that would be applicable to the village center commercial. So this could be moot in the sense that it's not a necessary thing to then redraw. I mean, it might just be redundant to identify it as historic. But just sort of the thought, I wasn't sure if there was some, desire to kind of take that step and say, all right, well, this is the structures and the things that we consider to be, a part of our local historic zoning district.
Molly, I don't have the comprehensive plan in front of me, but I know there was a desire for the traditional design of the buildings to be maintained. Mm-hmm. I think that was a section in the comprehensive plan as we discussed it. Mm-hmm. So, maybe that's where we need to look and see what what folks had in mind when they talked about that.
I think that the downtown area, the whole downtown area, it is really where we want to see that.
Okay.
In the village center commercial.
I think what Molly was saying too, when you guys see the design guidelines for that area, we'll revisit this topic to say, you know what, do these get you to where you want to be currently?
Right.
Because I think the design language, with or without a historic district, will get you much farther than you currently have been.
Yeah.
Right.
And then we can, once you've had an opportunity to try those on for size, you can say, you know what, maybe we do want to inch it a little further along. It's always a balancing act, because once the design standards are in here and this code is adopted, this is going to be a market improvement for you. But you don't want to overreach too soon, and have the entire code get controversial because of one issue. And we've seen historic districts create that controversy.
Yeah.
We're not afraid of it. We want to understand we're doing a lot of good here. Let's not get it bogged down because of one issue. Not saying we're there, but that's the trade-off.
And it sounds like, in terms of, this is a little bit down the road, but when we get there with the design standards, it sounds like we're essentially talking about a series of standards that set essentially the baseline bar for that traditional character. And then we have the opportunity to establish some guidance for if you are rehabbing or reusing a structure that happens to be in this historic district. Here's some guidelines and things as part of that as well. And like John's talking about, we can, that's a full spectrum of, should to shall, and everything, everything in between on how prescriptive you want to be. But we can definitely deal with that when we get there. All right. This was a really, just kind of as a note, we don't get to actually draw out with our committees, the districts, and kind of work out our thoughts in real time with you. And I think that worked really well when we did that in the last meeting. So, if you have any thoughts on, we maybe went a parcel too far over or rethinking some of this stuff, definitely let us know. Nothing's set in stone at this point, but it's certainly there's certainly opportunity to revise this as needed moving forward. All right. So for the additional uses, this will be the next section that we send out. And if you note in the draft that we sent, in the use tables, there's a section that says additional regulations. And right now there's some placeholders, it'll say section XX. When this section is drafted together, essentially that's the trigger that tells someone, all right, I'm looking to do a home occupation and I need to go to this section because there's additional regulations on what I'm trying to do. And the point of all of this, obviously, is, there might be uses that could be desirable, but they have some aspects that may be incompatible. So how do we best mitigate, any of those potential negative impacts and control them so that, we can still allow the greatest amount of flexibility in terms of land use, but preserve, the character and the quality of life of the neighborhood and the village at large. The thing to remember with these, because we used to call them specified use regulations, and I think that started to get confusing because people would start to think that they were only applicable to specially permitted uses. But that's not the case. So these requirements in the draft, when you get it, when you're reading it, think about the fact that regardless of whether or not that use is permitted or specially permitted, you have to meet those standards. So if I'm in a district where a bed and breakfast is specially permitted, as part of my special permit review process, I'm going to need to prove that I meet all of the requirements that are in this section. If I'm in a district that permits a bed and breakfast by right, I still have to meet the requirements of this section. So they apply evenly across the board to the uses, regardless of whether or not their status as a permitted or specially permitted use. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't matter the district. It doesn't matter the means of permitting. They have to meet these.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So this is kind of a comparison list. And one is kind of the new ones, the ones that we've heard a lot from a lot of communities about. This, this isn't saying this has to be the list. If you're saying, you know what, we're not, drive-through facilities, we're not all that concerned. We don't think we need additional regulations for them. We can strike that. This is just kind of the list that we see pretty common for a lot of communities. The multifamily dwellings one can be really helpful if we're talking about whether, you're establishing a multifamily dwelling by conversion or new construction. There's a lot of design standards and requirements that we can put into there. Similarly, drive-through facilities, if there's some screening required or maybe increased setbacks and things as part of those. And then the list on the right are those that I pulled out of what is in your current code. So there is an accessory apartment section in there. We're going to take that and adapt that, and we'll use the term accessory dwelling units. It tends to be a little bit easier to define and follow in the code. But then, some of these other ones I think make good sense. The gasoline stations, auto repair, and auto sales. Are there others on here, or are there some that you don't think make sense anymore? Like the stabling farm animals and storage of manure, fertilizer, things like that. Is that something that, we're looking to kind of maintain moving forward?
It's an allowed use.
It is listed as a use with some additional requirements. So my guess is that it's allowed. It's interpreted to be allowed as an accessory use, but it has these additional requirements of setbacks and things and whatnot, and how you're mitigating smells and things like that.
That's taking the country feel kind of thing too far.
Yeah. So, but I'm not sure, if there are a lot of people stabling farm animals or storing manure and fertilizer, and if that's not the case, probably just strike that one.
There's only one. There's only one
Really?
in the village.
Okay.
One.
Bergen's has a farm in the village with horses.
Oh gosh, yes.
So the commercial communication towers I saw on there.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be like the cell tower.
Yeah, and that'll be, again, sort of the terminology, we'll rebrand it, update it. It'll be telecommunications facilities.
Okay.
Now, the one thing with that is, there's some pretty good language out there that we've seen and used for, it applies pretty generally to communications equipment and things like that, but there hasn't been a lot tested or established yet to date about things like microcells or 5G. This is essentially dealing more with, there's a parcel and a telecommunication. Somebody wants to establish a telecommunication tower for Wi-Fi or something like that. But when you start to get into the more intense scale of these telecommunications facilities, it's sort of like how we look at solar regulations. You could have solar panels in your backyard or on your roof as an accessory use, but if you're looking to establish a solar farm, that's something that probably is going to need to be looked at and regulated outside of the zoning code with more robust language.
Yeah, we have a new 5G regulation.
Okay. All right. So can you share that with me? Because then some of this might be redundant, and that way I won't.
Yeah, I'll send it over to you tomorrow.
Okay. So is the general consensus then maybe the stabling of farm animals and the storage of manure and that is something that can maybe go?
Yeah.
Okay.
Some years ago, we did some discussion about outside solid fuel burning thing too. I don't remember.
Yeah, that seems like it's something that was in the code. And I'm not sure the extent to which there's a lot of those in the village,
Yeah.
but
I don't think they do that as much as they used to.
Actually, it was an update that we did.
in the zoning, or is that outside of the
It was
zoning?
in the zoning.
Okay. So
It was
would
a
that
hot
really-
topic. It was a hot topic back then. It was 2007, I think.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's updated.
All right. So then, my last question on this, when we're talking about this, and we've talked about this a lot, the home occupations example, these two pictures here, they're both home occupations. They clearly both have two different impacts or present themselves in very different ways in the neighborhoods that they are in. So all the regulations and guidance that we'll have, we can obviously make sure that things like the image on the top right don't happen, and we're allowing, but we're allowing for the flexibility and the, better economic return and things like that for some people in their homes with home occupations. The image on the bottom left. Are there any other issues or uses or things that have come before you when you're thinking, you know what, gee, we really don't have enough guidance on this, or someone requested to do this and it became an issue because of X, Y, and Z?
We just had a call on something that we could not figure out whether it would be permitted or not. It was a cat rescue.
A cat rescue?
Where the woman ended up going to the town, but she wanted to purchase a house in the village. It would have been in the downtown area, but she wanted to run a 501(c) cat rescue out of the home. And so I did some research on it because it was not anywhere in our zoning, whether it was permitted or not. So those types of things like cat rescue, dog rescue, that is not anywhere that I could see.
Okay. And was she looking like she was going to buy the house and live in it, or she was just going to establish?
She was going to buy a house. She was going to buy a house, live in it, and run the cat rescue out of the house.
Okay. So all right. So, okay. So the more we talk about this, I'm definitely seeing the ways that we can kind of break down the different classifications of home occupations. Because again, that's something that we might be able to deal with on that front. Okay. So cat rescue, dog rescue.
Molly, it's kind of like your house.
Hey. Tom resents that comment. Okay. Anything now? One of the other things too I want to note. A lot of, and this is really common, we see this in a lot, but for example, the gas station regulation, the additional regulations on gas stations in the code require essentially double the lot size and the lot width requirements. That's not likely to be, there's some where it makes sense to have an increased setback, but things like the lot size and the lot width aren't generally the types of additional restrictions that get put on there. It's more about proximity to residential, about screening, about, maintaining the character of the home or the neighborhood, whether it's design or, another one for home occupations is how if you do require parking, how much of it and where, and those kinds of things. So just so you know, some of that stuff will be kind of pulled out, but we'll still hopefully try to deal with some of the concerns with alternate mitigating regulations. All right. So that's all we had to go through, and I don't want to cut anybody short. If there's any other comments or questions on the zoning districts that we sent, you'll have time, continue to go through those if you'd like, and send us your comments. I'd say comments by the end of this month, if you can, just because that'll help us get those in, and we can get the revised versions out and base sort of the next drafts of sections on those. And on our end, like I said, we'll wrap up the additional use regulations draft and get that out to you to take a look at, and we'll start digging into the development standards.
Awesome. Looks great.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Anybody got anything else? A quiet group.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of a joke, but none that came to mind was appropriate.
Were you zoning it out?
And it is but I'm bummed. Two planners walk into a bar.
It was John and Molly because they really like to drink beer.
I miss bars.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you guys enjoy the holiday weekend coming up.
Yeah. Do we want to set up a plan for our next meeting? I know we've been going off of your planning board meeting schedule, so do we just want to look to potentially the next one into June?
Yeah, that would be great. What is the date on that? I don't have my phone. I've lost all track of days.
It's the third Wednesday, right?
Yes.
That's the 17th.
I want to pop in and just say that I'm sure it wasn't a lot of fun to set this up, but this actual meeting worked really well. The technology worked great. Everybody's clear. I just want to commend everybody because I think that as seamless as switching to in-person to virtual as it could go, that's how this went. It went really well.
I agree.
Yes, I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dan. Dan's got his camera off, but we'll
Yes.
give Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks,
Like
Dan.
I said, you guys are the gold standard for virtual attendance. We're gonna have to start shaming some of our other clients.
Yeah, they're no virgin.
No,
That's right.
I'm still here.
We say that all the time about a lot of places.
So do we want to? We can target June 17th. That way we'll get comments back to us if you can by the end of this month or first week of June, and then we'll get the next batch of material for you to look at out to you ahead of that meeting.
Okay, terrific.
Okay. All right, so Dan, I think we're good to pull. What are we trying to say? Get offline and.
Very well. I will end the stream, and like you said, if we have to schedule another meeting and use the same format, I'll see you guys in a month or so.
Yeah. Not sure. Like you were talking about with the village, when if and when you'll get back to in-person meetings and things like that. But obviously, we can still set this up if necessary. So, all right.
Very well.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.